Funding for this lecture is, in part, Jim and Mary Claire Sczepaniak were generous supporters of Lewis, and part of their legacy lives on through endowing this lecture series. The lectures began in October 2016 and are inspired by Jim's appreciation of public history programs. Jim Sczepaniak taught high school history for 33 years, first in Lockport High School, and then at what's now Romeoville High School. He took great pride in his civic involvement and proudly served on the Joliet Public Library Board of Trustees for more than 30 years. A gift from his estate created this lecture series and a number of scholarships that live on today, supporting students and supporting scholarship here at Lewis. His widow, Fran, could not be here today, but she asked me, when she called to send her regrets, she said, "Give me a report." So, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna say, Fran, I got up there, I talked about the legacy and what that's doing here at Lewis, and I'm gonna look at the audience without my bifocals on, and I'm gonna say, you too could leave a legacy. That's what I do here. I am in university advancement for Lewis. But truly, I do want to encourage you to think about the power of having a conversation with a nonprofit organization that you care about today. I'm happy to talk to you about Lewis. And think about how your current giving could translate into a gift that is invested and keeps your legacy, whatever you love, going for years to come in the future. And with the Sczepaniaks, we had that conversation with them while they were here, and then when he passed away, a gift from his estate is really what funded this lecture series. So thanks for letting me talk about that. Now, I have the honor of introducing Professor Dennis Kremen, who's going to introduce our speaker. Professor Kremen has been teaching at Lewis since 2004. And with his boundless energy and ability to inspire and infect students with a love of history, he leads many projects at Lewis and beyond our campus, including the Howard and Lewis Edelman Regional History Center and leading our Lasallian Study Abroad program in Rome. And one of his books has just been released in paperback called Grant Park, The Evolution of Chicago's Front Yard. So we are so lucky to have Professor Kremen here. Welcome.
Thank you, Naomi. It's been so fun to partner with you here at Lewis University, and thank you for all the hard work that you do. We also have Gaylord Building as a co-sponsor of this event. They're a not-for-profit, and also Canal Corridor, they're also a not-for-profit. So think about them and the wonderful work that they're doing as well. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. William C. Barnett, and his talk, Place, Region, and Changing Human Interactions with Nature. He's a professor at North Central College. He teaches a number of courses in American history and also teaches environmental studies. Most recently, he was a co-editor of a book called City of Lake and Prairie, Chicago's Environmental History. This came out in 2020. He's also developed a course in public history. Again, this idea of getting students to look outward, maybe thinking about museums, archives, historic preservation projects, those types of things. Really important for our students to feel connected in that way, and we share that. On a personal note, I really appreciate Will's intelligence and good humor. He also studied with William Cronin and made it possible for me to meet him, which my all-time favorite book is William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis. So it was a top moment for me, and it was brought to me none other than Will. We've interacted many times at programs at Neighbor Settlement, and he's just simply doing wonderful work. So today he'll be speaking on the theme that I've already mentioned. Let's hear it for Will Barnett.
Thank you all for coming out today. So I'm going to talk about place, region, and changing human interactions with nature. Another way to think about that is I'm going to talk about environmental history. Environmental history might be a term that you heard about when you were a student. It's a fairly new field. William Cronin, you're talking about, is one of the founders of that field, and he just retired from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the author that Dennis is talking about. Environmental history, put simply, is the relationship between people and nature, that nature obviously shapes our world, and people shape nature. For most of human history, we haven't had the idea that people could damage nature. The sense until really the 1800s was that forests were limitless and species wouldn't go extinct. But we're in a very different world in the last 150 years or so, thinking about the fact that people are dramatically changing nature with the innovation of the atomic bomb and with climate change. So this topic is fascinating to me, and I am going to be talking in very general terms today. I'm not going to go deep into one topic like Medewan or the Potawatomi or the canal, but talking in a discussion that really links them all together. And what I want to do today is think about nature, think about place, think about region with you. Nature clearly sets limits. It doesn't determine what we do. I don't believe in environmental determinism, but it creates the world and the choices that we have. This map is showing rainfall in the United States. Nature creates regions within our country. The western half of this map, those red and orange colors, are places that get very little precipitation. The eastern half of this map, it's completely different, very green, regular rainfall. And I teach a class on the history of the American West, and one of the things I have to teach students right away is that the West is an arid place. And when you think about cowboys out west, one of the reasons they're cowboys, they're grazing cattle on the land, is that land isn't reliable, its rainfall isn't reliable enough to farm it without extensive irrigation efforts. So when we think about cowboys out west, it's because the West is arid. The eastern half of this map doesn't have that problem. We live in an area that's a promising agricultural region for a very long time. But nature is going to set limits on us, but humans make choices within those limits. A different map here, this one's much more oriented north and south rather than east and west. This is not rainfall, but growing season. In the dark shaded areas on the southern part of this map, the growing seasons are 240 days. So you can do things in Florida and Louisiana you can't do in Illinois. You can grow oranges, you can grow sugarcane. Good luck trying that in Illinois. And if you go up to Minnesota, you'll get half the growing season, 120 days. And so we're in a place that has good rainfall, but a shorter growing season, and that's going to change the way humans choose to live in this landscape. And these, but humans make many choices within the limits set by nature. Some of those shaded regions in the deep south and with the long growing seasons also are characterized by having plantation agriculture with enslaved people doing that work. That's obviously a human choice. It's not a choice that would make much sense in northern Minnesota with the short growing season, but in the deep south, that was a story that built the American economy of enslaved people working on plantation agriculture in the 1600s, the 1700s, and the 1800s. I want to think about place today. Where are we? And there's a simple but powerful quote from Wendell Berry, who's an author who writes about agriculture. Wendell Berry says, "If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are." And I impress on my students that you really want to think about, where do you come from? The first day I meet my students, I say, are you from a rural community, or are you from the suburbs, or are you from a city? And how does that shape you? Because it does shape you. It might take you a little longer in life to figure out that the place you grew up has shaped your mindset and shaped your values. So I want you to think, I'm not going to call on you, where are we right now? Beyond saying Lewis University, beyond saying Romeoville, what defines this space that we're all in? A little bit bigger than Romeoville. What is the surrounding area all about? What has it been? What is it now? And what might it be in the future? And that's sort of the way I'm framing this talk. If you look at a map of this, the screen's not huge, but you can see Joliet down here at the bottom of this map, and right up here is Lewis, and over here is Lockport. So this map is quite complicated. I mean, you could spend a lot of time looking at this. The white areas to the south of us and to the west of us are agricultural lands. Lots of other colors on the map. In the northeast, there's a sort of a bright yellow color. That's Chicagoland. And there are industrial regions here, suburban regions, farmland. We're in a really interesting mix of landscapes. You can go in different directions and find petrochemical refineries or cornfields or wealthy suburbs. It's a fascinating place we're in, and it's not an easy place to define. So where are we right now? You might have thought, well, we're by Lockport, and we're hearing about the Illinois-Michigan Canal. That's what's bringing us together, and that's a great story. We'll hear more about that in a little over an hour. We're near Joliet and Lamont. You can see smokestacks driving down here. We're in an area that's still industrialized, but past its heyday of industrialization. Many of the steel mills and ironworks that were once creating jobs here are no longer open. We are clearly in Chicagoland, and that might have been the first thing that came to your mind, is that, okay, this is the Chicago area. You might have thought more in a broader sense, we're in Illinois. I want to think not really focus on Chicago today. I think Chicago gets a great deal of attention, but to think about the edge of Chicago and this place we're in that isn't quite Chicago, but it's influenced by Chicago. And you might have thought we're in the Midwest. I put region in the title of this talk. And that's the typical answer to what region are we in, is the Midwest, but that's an interesting term as well. We zoom out from the first map I've shown you to a bigger map. Clearly, Chicago's at the center of this version of where we are, and Lake Michigan's there too. And we're on the periphery of that, and that's an interesting relationship to be outside of the city, but connected to the city. A view of Chicago from above, not a map, but a photograph, gives you a sense of a very man-made place. All these straight lines on the land, all this electricity, all these buildings. Chicago's a profoundly altered place, and I think that's obvious to everyone, but the farmlands around here are also profoundly altered, and that isn't obvious to everyone. This map gives us a sense of that photograph that we're near an urban-rural boundary, and it's been expanding relentlessly for decades. But those pink shaded areas are developed urban lands, the yellow areas are croplands, and we're sort of astride this boundary that we're not in the city, but we're near the city. We're also near farmland, and that makes this a really interesting part of the world. If you went to regions and said we're in the Midwest, I think that's a great answer, and we all have powerful ideas of what is the Midwest. This map shows the Midwest as all those green states, and Illinois is squarely in the middle of the Midwest. Illinois is surrounded by Midwestern states. But why aren't we connected to Kentucky, that's just south of us? Kentucky's in the south. And we have ideas that not many people would say Kentucky's Midwestern. There's another label just to the right of the Midwest where it says the Great Lakes states. And that's a good answer as well, that we're in the Great Lakes states. I think you'd have to bring in New York and Pennsylvania because they're part of the Great Lakes, and you'd have to push out Kansas and Nebraska and North Dakota and South Dakota and Iowa and Missouri. They're not part of the Great Lakes. So we're in the middle of the Midwest. I think we're on the edge of the Great Lakes, and there's sort of a tug of war. The Midwest we think of as pretty agricultural, and Illinois certainly is that. The Great Lakes I think is more urban and industrial, and Illinois is that as well. So we're sort of on an urban-rural boundary. So I think Great Lakes is a great answer for where we are. The Rust Belt is a term I use a lot in classes about 20th century America, thinking about the fact this is a highly industrial area, but its glory days are behind it in many ways. Gary, Indiana, doesn't produce as much steel as they used to. Rockford, Illinois, Joliet, Aurora. So these are some terms that think about a region going through change, and maybe a region that isn't quite at its peak for one version of itself, but I want to go back to multiple versions of this region. We just heard an excellent talk on Medewin National Tallgrass Prairie. I don't know if anyone but the two folks here from Medewin said this place, the thing that I think of in this place is that we're in the tallgrass prairie zone. You might be an environmental studies or ecology major if you thought that. But that's another way to think about this place. It's very different from Rust Belt, but these things are side by side. We're 19 miles, did you say, from Medewin? And we're 5 miles from the ironworks site in Joliet. This is a map of the Rust Belt, if that's not a term that's familiar to you. very clearly located around the Great Lakes, steel mills, auto factories, and many of these factories are rusting and decaying. Some of them closed in the 60s or 70s or 80s and haven't reopened. Lots of interesting political ramifications from that history. So here Chicago is connected to the Great Lakes, to an urban industrial Midwest that perhaps is trying to figure out where it's going next, because steel, coal, and auto factories don't seem like the great economy they were in the 1900, 1920, 1940, even 1960. But tall grass, I want to start with prairie. Let's give like a quick overview, but when I sort of think about this chronologically, we're in a vast area that is defined by prairie, different kinds of prairie. The green areas are tall grass prairie, and that ecosystem once completely dominated what's now the state of Illinois. The light green is mixed grass, and then the yellow is short grass. And that's all about that first map I put up about precipitation. The rainy Great Lakes region can support tall grass prairie. You get out to the arid Montana, you can't support the tall grass prairie. You're gonna be in short grass prairie. So we are at the edge of the Great Lakes, at the edge of this urban industrial juggernaut that is now struggling a bit as a Rust Belt region. We're also at the sort of point of the spear of the prairies pushing, at their easternmost capacity. That this is a profoundly important part of where we are, is that we're in a region that was once dominated by tall grass prairie. It is very hard to see tall grass prairie in this state now. Restoration efforts happened because we realized it's almost gone. So this was a dominant story for Illinois, for Iowa, and it is very hard to see tall grass prairie in Iowa as well. These two states have a lot in common in the tall grass prairie world. I'll talk about Iowa just a bit today. And so if I was gonna generalize, not with names like Lamont or Midwest or Great Lakes, but where are we right now? I would say we're in a region that has profoundly changed, more than most states. You can find a lot of wilderness in Alaska, in the deserts of the Southwest, in the swamps of Florida, in the forests of Maine, and you could go places and see large expanses of land that doesn't look much different than 1492 before the Europeans arrived. But that's not true in Illinois. That's not true in Iowa. This region has been profoundly changed first from tall grass prairie that's been virtually eliminated, which was transferred to farmland in a matter of a couple generations. Lots of hard work and sweat, but a quick transfer of this ecosystem from tall grass prairie to farmland. And then a second, later transformation of some parts of this farmland to urban, industrial, and suburban landscapes like we see in Chicagoland. So you have to go 2 layers deep in a developed region to get down from the urban development down to what was once farmland, and then another layer deep to tall grass prairie. And these are important stories to think about where are we? What was this place once? And what could it be again? These maps demonstrate that idea of tall grass prairie being virtually eradicated from the landscape. On the left map, 2 colors that are important, green for forest, mostly in the southern part of Illinois. And you look over in the right map, the left map is the early 1800s, the right map is current day. Illinois has been deforested to a huge extent, but I'm not really here to talk about forest today. I want to talk more about prairie, because the region we're in, there wasn't that much forest to begin with. The tan color in the left-hand map is prairie and grassland, and it was once the dominant land cover for the state. The right-hand map, I wish the colors were more distinct, that tan is gone and now it's yellow, and that yellow is croplands, that almost everywhere that was once tall grass prairie is now croplands. And much of what was forest is now croplands as well. This landscape has been completely transformed, and I think to some people who don't think about the ecology that much, they might feel like driving through an area of agricultural farmland is not that different from driving through a grassland of the tall grass prairie. They're very different. I mean, for one thing, the cornfields are monoculture, it's one species, and the prairie and the tall grass prairie was an incredibly diverse ecosystem. Iowa shows this maybe easier than Illinois. A map of Iowa showing land cover in 1850, all that yellow space is prairie. That's the original ecosystem of most of Iowa. And the green is wooded, and you jump ahead from the middle of the 1800s to now. There's a little bit of yellow left to the southern part of Iowa, south of Des Moines, but not much. And there's very little forest, there's very little prairie, it is overwhelmingly cropland, right? To put this into very simple numbers, Iowa's land cover in 1850 was about 80% prairie. Illinois was about 61% prairie. Iowa today is 1/10% original high-quality prairie. And Illinois is even worse. Illinois is 1/100% of the land cover is now high-quality original prairie. This is a profound transformation that we don't think about enough. What happened? Farmers came in and planted corn, right? Obviously, it's not just corn. They planted a lot of wheat in the 1800s. Now we plant a lot of soybeans, but corn is the dominant story. Illinois produces 15% of the nation's corn, Iowa 17%. The two of them, that adds up to 32%. Almost a third of the nation's corn comes from these two states. And the whole state is filled with cornfields outside of the northeast corner of Chicagoland and a few other places. Human choices did this. This wasn't by accident, right? People made decisions. The choice to replace the tall grass prairie was work. People plowed those fields. The choice to specialize in growing corn. Corn is fascinating because corn is here before 1492. Corn comes from this land. Corn is brought up from Mexico. It's indigenous to the Americas. But specializing in it is something different. And planting it as a monocrop, that's all you have and all your acreage is corn, is something different as well. The choice to develop an urban society is not inevitable. Some societies got heavily urbanized, some don't. The choice to develop an industrial society is not inevitable either. Sometimes we think, well, what happened had to happen. Well, there are different forks in the road where different choices could have been made. And you can be urban without being an industrial. I want to talk about some indigenous communities that were in Illinois that were urban without being industrial. There are other choices to think about. Are you focusing on sort of communal agriculture, sort of open fields that the community farms together? Or this is about private property and individual families. Are you trying to build an egalitarian society, maybe a community of small farmers who all own their own land? Or is this a strictly hierarchical society with great power at the top and inequality at the bottom? That can exist in the modern day with the wealth of our billionaires. And that can exist in indigenous communities with very powerful leaders and people at the bottom of the hierarchy that are not equal. Another question is, okay, you're farming, and maybe you're farming corn, but is this a subsistence economy where you're really eating the food that you grow, or are you farming for a market? Or is this capitalism? Are you trading that, or is this commercial agriculture? And there seems like a steady movement from subsistence economy towards commercial agriculture, but there are choices being made all along the way there. So I want to talk about 4 societies today, and just a few minutes on each of them. The Cahokia Mound Builders, who are in Illinois, across the river from St. Louis, well south of here, but still a really important story to think about early Illinois. Then the nation of the Illinois tribal nation, which is both a language family of Illinois speakers and a confederation of about a dozen smaller tribes, but under organized leadership. So Cahokia was a dominant power in this region from about 1050 to 1350. That society collapsed. The Illinois society grows up in the late 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. Then the French arrive. We're now into this contact between indigenous peoples and Europeans. The French are in this region for about 100 years, to keep it simple, and they overlap with the Illinois. They have alliances with the Illinois. They're trading with them a lot. Anglo-Americans, people who spoke English, I'm speaking English here today because that is the language of the region. It could have been French if people had made different choices. But we're speaking English here because Anglo-Americans, the British defeated the French in the French and Indian War in 1763. Some French settlers, French-speaking families, hung around the region a bit, but the Anglo-Americans poured in and outnumbered them, and we're all speaking English. The Cahokia Mound Builders are a fascinating story. I feel like I agree completely with the previous speaker saying, go down to Midewin, it's not that far away. I also want you to go to Cahokia, it's not that far away, and to visit this site. It is the largest urban society in indigenous America, north of Mexico. I mean, and American tourists will buy plane tickets to go see Aztec and Mayan ruins and not go see Cahokia, which is in our backyard almost. So it's an enormous archaeological site with fascinating findings, huge mounds. Lots of damage has been done by interstate highway builders and farmers, but there's still huge mounds on this landscape, an enormous area of acreage that was dominated. And I'm pulling on I'll try to give credit to different authors. I'm pulling on a recent book called Cahokia, Ancient America's Great City on the Mississippi by an archaeologist. And Cahokia is a different way to live in this place 1,000 years ago. But they had 20 to 40,000 people, at least 20,000 in this location. Cahokia was larger than London in the 1300s. Cahokia is a major urban center at this point, and a very hierarchical regime. Cahokia is performing human sacrifices, and the people at the top have immense religious and political power. So if we don't think about North American indigenous peoples as being urbanized, that's wrong. They were, and not just in Mexico, but here in Illinois. And they grow corn. The corn runs through all of these stories. They also grow sunflowers and squash and beans, but corn is really important to them, and they have suburban regions around the central religious and political area where they are supporting this urban area with farmers growing corn. Cahokia is highly urban 1,000 years ago. Cahokia is very hierarchical. Is not about private property, it's about communal farmlands. This is obviously pre-capitalist, pre-industrialist, but they're involved in notable long-distance trade, that archaeologists find goods at the Cahokia site that were, from Texas, from Louisiana, and they find goods produced in Cahokia hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Cahokia, that this is a society that has a major regional impact. So it's a fascinating thought piece to think about how did this group of people choose to live on this land? Corn is important, but they're urbanized, and I just want you to think about the fact that there are many different groups have lived here, and the Cahokia story is a fascinating one, and you can investigate it more by driving down to the St. Louis area to explore Cahokia. Next, I want to talk about the Illinois Confederation, a language family and a group of tribes who are important in this region from the 1300s to the 1700s. There are certain tribes in North America that we talk about more in history classes. In colonial history, we might talk a lot about the Iroquois in the Northeast and the Great Lakes. In the history of the American West, we'll talk a lot about the Lakota, formerly known to folks as the Sioux. We don't talk about the Illinois on a nationwide level. The Illinois are not a crucial story in our history textbooks if it's not a history of Illinois. They're a really powerful confederation that are a crucial ally of the French and play a major role in the history of the mid-continent, of the center of this continent. They're powerful warriors. These are images drawn by French artists because the French overlapped with the Illinois. Very powerful regional force in the 1500s and the 1600s. The French couldn't set up their society without a partnership with the Illinois. The Illinois would have blocked the connections that the French were building in their North American empire. The book I'm drawing on the most here is a book called People of the Ecotone by Robert Morrissey, who teaches at the University of Illinois, and he's an environmental historian. He analyzes the Illinois nation. His idea, the ecotone, I've already alluded to this idea, that we're on a boundary here. We're on an ecological boundary with the Great Plains to the west and the woodlands of the Great Lakes to the east. And this Native American Confederation, the Illinois, are benefiting from being in that border zone. They're trading with folks east who speak Algonquian languages, and they're trading with folks west who speak Siouan languages, and they are sort of this intermediary. Chicagoland, Illinois is often sort of a pivot point for history. So these images from French artists showing an Illinois leader smoking a tobacco pipe, covered in tattoos that talk about his wartime exploits, circa 1600. These two societies overlap. And in general, we think about Europeans arriving in North America and immediately going to war with native peoples and driving them out. The French didn't do that. It's another sort of, well, what if the French had stayed? Would we have a better relationship with the Native Americans? Would the Potawatomi have been driven out if the French were the ones who were ruling this place? The French were badly outnumbered by the Illinois. They never had large settlements, and they didn't intend to drive the Illinois out. They formed partnerships with them. They really looked at the Illinois as a more powerful group than the French. The Illinois did fascinating things that we don't talk about very much. They hunted bison on foot. They did not have horses, and they had been hunting bison on foot through the 1500s, through the 1600s, through the 1700s, in an era of sort of what we call the Little Ice Age, an area of cooler climate in this region in the 1500s. Many bison moved into Illinois. More bison than had been there in the 1300s and more bison than would be there in the 1700s. But they were bison hunters without the horses that we imagine of the Plains Indians. So they're hunting bison on foot. And they have an urban center as well, a large urban center known as the Grand Village of the Kaskaskias, sometimes called the Grand Village of the Illinois. And this location is just a little bit west of Starved Rock State Park. And this location had 10,000 people in it. And you might think, well, that's not a very big city. That's a big urban center in 1680. That's larger than Boston was in 1680. So the Illinois are a major force. New Orleans won't get to 10,000 people until 1800. And the Illinois had 10,000 people in 1680. So this is a significant urban location, and they are trading with the French. The French who are in the Grand Village are sort of a magnet bringing in more Native Americans because they have trade goods and there's economic benefits to being friends with the French. But this is another group of people who are urban and who are more important and more powerful than I think a lot of us know about our region. Illinois is a fascinating region. The Grand Village is seen in several maps here. This map shows that you've got this Great Plains Indian group and this Great Lakes Indian group, and we're right on that borderline, right on that sort of a straddle of two worlds. The map on the right, you have to look here, it says the Ancien Village des Illinois. My French is not good, but the ancient village of the Illinois. This is way closer to us than Cahokia, and it's not a historical site that you can tour in the same way. But this is really our backyard here. The Illinois Nation, urban society, a very hierarchical society. They went out and raided enemy tribes like the Pawnee and captured captives. This is done in all of human history to attack enemies and take captives. But the Illinois wanted to capture women from other tribal nations, and they enslaved them and made them process all the bison hides from their enormous bison hunt, especially when it became a trade good with the French, that they were trading bison hides. So they had a very hierarchical society where the first wife of an important warrior would be from the ethnic community and would have power, but the third wife of that important warrior would be a captive. So it's quite an unequal society, but a powerful military force, and they specialize in hunting bison, and they're involved in long-distance trade. Bison hides from Illinois are going to go to Europe. And so this is a bison hide, a painted robe that a museum in France holds and labels this as from the Illinois. So they are engaged in long-distance trade, urban. They're eating corn and squash and beans, but the bison hunt is crucial to their status and to their trade. So moving into the French, we've already been talking about the French a bit. They arrive in the 1670s in this region of Illinois and are here for a century, but they don't have the powerful footprint that the Illinois had or that the Cahokia Society had. The image I chose here is a group of Native Americans in a canoe with one Frenchman with them, with a Catholic priest, right? The French are sending single men who are priests. They're sending fur trappers. They're not arriving with their wives and children and having a huge population boom. So the French are in partnership with the Iroquois in the Northeast and the Great Lakes, and with the Illinois here in Illinois. But they're a new presence in the landscape, and they have their own ideas about how to interact with nature. The fur trade is crucial to the French, whether we're talking Montreal, Quebec, Wisconsin, Illinois, and most of that fur trade is the beaver, but people are also trading for deer skin, they're trading for various other fur animals like otter and mink, and we know they're trading for bison hides. The French are driven by finding a commodity that is scarce in Europe, that is valuable, that can become a money maker, and that idea is it's crucial to think about capitalism. There's a commodity that we want to maximize our exploitation of to get rich, which is not something you see the Cahokia people seem to be doing at this point. We romanticize the idea of the French coming through here. This is a mosaic in Chicago of Joliet and Marquette in 1673, not a very historically accurate vision of what that meeting would have looked like. But the French are traveling through this region by boat. They see this land by water. They're in canoes, they're traveling the Mississippi River. These are the travels of Joliet and Marquette in 1673. They travel down a significant expanse of the Mississippi River, but not all the way down to New Orleans. They cut through the middle of Illinois on the Illinois River. And I think maybe you can't see it here. It says Chicago Portage right here. There's a gap where you can't take the Illinois River. It connects to the Mississippi, but it doesn't connect to the Great Lakes. But if you portage, you can get across that gap. And the French, in the 1600s, the French are saying, somebody should dig a canal here. That canal would be really useful. Then we wouldn't have to get out of our boat to get from the Illinois River and the Mississippi River watershed to the Great Lakes watershed. And this is what a portage looks like. The word in French is portage, to carry. So the Native Americans here are canoeing up to a place where they're going to haul their boats out and lift them up and carry them. And they're going to carry them to another watershed. In some places, Lewis and Clark think about doing this across mountain ranges, but this is really across a swampy area outside of Chicago, right? This isn't, and there's another one out in Wisconsin that's a really important regional portage site. So the French are traveling by boat in cooperation with Native Americans, and they're viewing this landscape, and they're envisioning the canal that will eventually be built, far larger and than they ever imagined. But the French do have some settlements here, but nothing as big as the grand village of the Kaskaskias, nothing as big as Cahokia. And most of the French settlements are in the southern third of the state, pretty far from here, the little dots down here. And the place names are used multiple times, but Cahokia, Kaskaskia, these communities in southern Illinois, these aren't urban places. These don't have large populations. Fort de Chartres, as an example, or Kaskaskia. They're a little sort of trading outpost and military base for the French, but they don't have 1,000 people in them. They're very small. They're growing some food crops, some grain to support other French centers. It's sort of the granary for the French. They realize this is excellent farmland. And when they develop New Orleans more, New Orleans will be growing crops like sugar and eating grains grown in Illinois. But the French have a different view here. They're here to cooperate with the Native Americans, not to drive them out. As we heard earlier, that the Potawatomi are really driven out. And the French see this as a link point in their view of North America that's all about waterways, right? Later, Chicago will be a link point in a railroad system, and today in an interstate highway system. But the original transportation corridor running through Illinois is the river system. And the French are going down to New Orleans, up past St. Louis, through the Illinois River, up to Chicago, through the Great Lakes, up to Montreal and Quebec. And Illinois is crucial to linking those worlds, that Canadian world as we understand it now with that Louisiana world. So Illinois is a really important part of the French effort to control North America. They won't hang on to it after the French and Indian War, but it's interesting to think about what if they had hung on to it? Would we have a better relationship with the native peoples of this region? Because they didn't seem to want to drive them out the way the English and then the United States did. So to summarize the French colonists, small villages in Illinois, not urban, a focus on communal farmlands. They had an open field system that we'd all in the village come out and farm together. It wasn't that your family had a farm and your family had a farm, but we were all communally farming. They're raising crops to feed New Orleans and other parts of the French colonies. They're involved in fur trade, bison hides, beaver, lots of trade. And so this is a society with notable long-distance trade. Earlier than the Anglo-Americans who come in. There's been trade through this region of different kinds in many, many ways, and it is still a trade corridor. On to the Anglo-Americans, the early 1800s. The French have lost the French and Indian War in 1763, and the Americans, after defeating the British in the Revolutionary War, are pushing west relentlessly. So my image of the Americans is not someone in a canoe with the French, but a farmer sowing, planting his farmland. And this map shows you people pushing west from the 13 colonies, across the Appalachian Mountains, into the eastern part of the Midwest. And one interesting thing to notice is, again, they're going to settle southern Illinois. They're not going to settle this region of Illinois up north, because the people coming, the Anglo-Americans coming, are coming from Virginia to Kentucky, and then from Kentucky to southern Illinois. So the center, and part of that I think is the longer growing season, is they're going to move into southern Illinois first. Northern Illinois will be settled later. When northern Illinois is settled, it's going to be more Yankees from the Northeast, from, who had been from New York and Ohio. They weren't Southerners from Virginia and Kentucky in general. This map shows United States, 1830. And the organized political map of Illinois shows you the important settlements are all in the southern third of it. That it's going to take a while to get up to northern Illinois. The Cahokia's down south, the French settlements are down south, and the early American settlements are in the southern part of the state. The focus of these early Americans is getting farmland for their families, private farmland. And the focus is on Indian removal, of pushing Indians north to Wisconsin, west across the Mississippi River, but pushing Indians out. And that is not the way the French approached this place, but that is the way these Americans will approach this place. I'm going to draw quickly on a book by John McFerricker, an older classic book. He's a historian of the American West who's studying a typical central Illinois community, Sugar Creek, and he's looking at it from the 1810s to the 1870s and sees huge changes in that period of just 2 generations. These Anglo-Americans who come in, they're organizing small villages. They're family farmers. They're not planning to build a big city. They don't build anything like Chicago. They're growing corn, they're growing wheat. Maple sugar is actually an important part of their story as well, because they want to be in the forested areas of Illinois. They're afraid to go out on the open plains, the real prairie. They want lumber and wood. They need it for fences and firewood, and they can't bring it in on a train. I mean, they have to have it locally. So they're settling in all the places called, Downers Grove, Maple Grove, Sugar Creek, is because the maple trees give them sugar. But this is really a subsistence economy. They're not connected by long distance trade. They're growing the food they eat. They have local exchange with neighbors. You might have more chickens and eggs, and I might have more honey, and you might have blacksmith skills, and we might trade eggs for honey, whatever it is, but we're not shipping a commodity to Europe or to New York City. We're very subsistence focused, a local farm community. They do have private property, even though they really rely on their community. But it's really about local exchange. Those are the early settlers here, driving out the Native Americans and setting up these quite egalitarian small farm communities. But things change rapidly. Their farm would have been a subsistence farm with a wide variety of animals, chickens, pigs, cows, sheep, and they're not specializing in one thing the way a modern farmer specializes in corn and soybeans. They've got all kinds of crops here, but they're largely eating what they grow, and they're not figuring out a single commodity like beaver skins or bison hides to send to a faraway market. The first generation, Farragher argues, is communal, local exchange, subsistence farming, what I've just described, but 50 years later, the children or grandchildren of those early settler families are much more individualistic, much more interested in long-distance trade, and they've really on a clear path to becoming commercial farmers who are sending their goods to a distant market, who are part of a truly capitalist mercantile economy. This map shows you that in the 1820s, Illinois is not exporting a whole lot of farm goods anywhere else. But by the 1830s, it's starting to explode. But northern Illinois hasn't exploded yet. There's sort of a gap in north central Illinois, but it's coming. And soon the entire state will be exporting grains to the rest of the country. By the Civil War and the post-Civil War era, vast areas of Illinois have gone under the plow. They're not really building a lot of urban communities, but just so many small farm communities, growing corn, growing wheat, a wide variety of livestock. They're shifting to commercial agriculture in a generation or two. And they're involved in long distance trade because they've got transportation. And that's the story, the Illinois and Michigan Canal, and then the railroads, as they're connected to places far away not by the river system that the French used or the Cahokia people used. Going overland by railroad is really going to make this economy explode into commercial agriculture. You can go to Klein Creek Farm that's run by DuPage County and see what a family farm looked like in the late 18 or early 1900s. Tremendous diversity, all kinds of animals, all kinds of crops. You need to grow hay because you have livestock. You need to grow oats. You don't just grow corn. Today, most farmers in Illinois don't grow hay or oats because they don't have any animals on their property. It's gasoline powered, and you just need corn and soybeans. You're completely part of the market now. There's no subsistence really left. And this seems relentless. Of course, capitalism, of course, the market, of course, technology. But different choices are always possible. The French give us a path that could have been different. The Mormons give us a path that could have been different. And this is another Illinois story that I think a lot of people forget. Nauvoo, Illinois is a town on the Mississippi River that was briefly larger than Chicago. They had 12,000 people in Nauvoo. Chicago's going to explode a decade later, but they're briefly larger than Chicago. Photographs of Nauvoo, Illinois. It's founded in 1839. These are Yankees. These are people who were in New York first. They're Anglo-American. They're Christian. They were forced to leave New York and go to Ohio because they were seen as different religiously, and there was hostility. They were forced to leave Ohio, and they came to Illinois. They're very communal. It's not really about private property and my family advancing. It's about the congregation and the community. They built an impressive community in Nauvoo. The church on the upper right is a recreation. The original church burned. But they're driven out of Nauvoo as well with violence. And the Mormons are going to settle Nauvoo in 1839. In 1846, they leave. Their leader is murdered, and they flee to Utah. And I think we know that that they ended up in Utah, but the fact that they were in Illinois is intriguing to think about. It's a great historical site to go visit. It's really a religious pilgrimage site for many Mormons. And the world they create in Utah captures their communal focus. They're going to go out to a very arid place in the American West with not much rainfall, and because of their communal focus, they're going to set up irrigation systems for the whole congregation, for the large community, not for individual family farmers. And that irrigation system is going to allow them to prosper. It's a different mindset. They come from the same places as the Yankees who settle here, New York, Ohio, but this communal focus creates a different world. So that's just another example of things might be different. In the final part of my talk, I want to think about the forces that gave us the world we have. The importance of private property is crucial. That the American settlers emphasized owning individual farms. And the state and the federal government facilitated that by pushing out Indians with treaties and Indian removal, and by setting up a system where land becomes a commodity, just like a beaver pelt, just like a bison hide, that land is something you know what the dollar amount it's worth, what's it worth per acre, and it's interchangeable. You're not asking, well, like, is that high quality land? You're just saying, land has a price. And that system is about laying down a grid, laying down graph paper, perfect squares onto the landscape of Illinois. You see the green areas here, the original places after the land ordinance of 1785 that have basically a grid of graph paper laid onto them, and then that facilitates sale. This is a Midwestern story. This is not the way land is organized on the East Coast. On the East Coast in Pennsylvania, every township has curving lines that might be about a river or a creek or a hillside. In Illinois, townships are perfect straight lines. Everything's square. The roads run north-south, they run east-west, because Thomas Jefferson and other Enlightenment thinkers sort of rationalized land into a commodity. So you can buy land in whatever township, the Afton township of DeKalb, you could buy that from hundreds of miles away and know exactly what land you got, and you can buy it and sell it, and it's really become a commodity. It's not unique, it's interchangeable. It's just a square of this checkerboard. And this system of land ownership is not seen in Europe. It's not seen on the East Coast. The blue areas are sort of the European style, that the boundaries are curving and they're about the landscape and the rivers and the hills. But all of the light tan areas are about laying down graph paper grid on the land. And so, zooming in on DeKalb County, you can see individual pieces of land, 160 acres to this family, to this family. This is 1 square mile. The map, it was really interesting, the Potawatomi map of the Shibona land was, Each big square is 640 acres, and the land they're fighting for is 1,280 acres. It's 2 squares, right? And they were offset. So this shaped the world of that Shabona State Park. This makes land private property, easily exchangeable. It's a commodity. It's not the way Native Americans ever think about land, that one family owns it, and it's bounded, and it's crucial to this experiment of turning tallgrass prairie wilderness into cropland. And when you fly over the United States, you don't see this where I grew up in New York. There's nothing looks like this flying over New York, but this is what the Midwest and the West look like because we've imposed this grid on the landscape. Agricultural technology is also an important part of this shift. Steel plows make this possible. Drain tiles, we don't talk about as much, make this possible. That farmers are going to eradicate tallgrass prairie. They're going to buy the land, which is a commodity. They're going to buy plows, and those plows are going to enable them to eradicate the deep roots of the tallgrass prairie. The plows invented by John Deere, who comes to Illinois in 1837, are going to be the death of tallgrass prairie because these strong, flexible steel plows, which are self-cleaning, cut deep into the ground, cut the roots, and then you plant crops on top of that, and the prairie grasses don't come back. So John Deere is going to revolutionize this region with his agricultural technology. The McCormick Reaper, also produced in Chicago or in Illinois factories, McCormick in Chicago, John Deere in the Quad Cities, are going to allow farmers to move in and harvest huge amounts of wheat or corn that they never could have harvested with the older systems. And then something we don't talk about much, Illinois drain tile, which is one of the major producers of Illinois drain tile, is Joliet as a community. But we heard about it in the Midewin talk, that Midewin is removing all of these drain tiles because what drain tile did was get rid of the wetlands. If you bought you bought a square of land, and you find out when you get there it's marshy, well, there's a fix for that. You get the drain tiles in, and now your land isn't marshy anymore. You've eliminated the wetlands. So these tools allow the farmers who bought this land to make it uniform, standard farmland, not prairie anymore and not wetlands. And now they can bring in huge, agricultural technology. This person's not a subsistence farmer, right? Nobody needs that much grain for one family. This is a commercial farmer who's sending crops to market. And his grandfather might have had a subsistence farm, but not anymore. So this explains the map I showed you really early on, that the tallgrass prairie has been eradicated by the private property mindset, by the agricultural technology of drain tile and plows, and now almost all of Illinois is that bright yellow cropland, right? So this is a profoundly changed place, and we've talked about how it changed. Transportation is our final talk of the day, is the Illinois and Michigan Prairie. And it is a story of government supporting transportation. State governments, New York State funded the Erie Canal, and later funding railroad corporations. This explosive era of Illinois being settled is also the canal era. And you see the Illinois and Michigan Canal at the western edge of my map, but look at all the canals all through the Northeast. Anywhere somebody wishes there was a river, they'll build a canal. And the Erie Canal is a huge change. The Erie Canal is going to link the East Coast to the Great Lakes. It used to cost $100 a ton to ship goods from Buffalo to New York City. You put the Erie Canal in, it costs $9 a ton to ship those goods. A team of horses used to pull a ton of grain, 10 miles, maybe 15 miles in a day. Now they can put 10 tons and float it on a boat, and the same team of horses can pull that boat 30 miles. So that's 20 times an efficiency improvement, right? The Erie Canal revolutionizes moving heavy goods to market, and we're going to build that in Illinois as well, right? So people used to travel overland from St. Louis in a wagon to Indianapolis. That's a very expensive way to move freight. But once you bring that Illinois and Michigan Canal into the story, in the place the French said, hey, there should be a canal here, you've opened up the farmers of the Midwest, of central Illinois, to be feeding urban people in New York and Boston and Philadelphia and even London and Paris. So the Illinois and Michigan Canal is one of the things that turns this region, that motivates farmers in this region to become capitalist commercial farmers selling goods to distant cities, which wasn't possible for their grandfathers and grandmothers. Chicago becomes a huge hub of shipping, and very soon Chicago will become a huge hub of railroads. I'm not going to spend time on the railroad story, but you see Chicago as radiating spokes on a wheel, railroads going north, going northwest, going west, going southwest, going south, and going southeast, and going east. All directions go into Chicago in this region, like all roads lead to Rome. Chicago is an important part of the story. We've mainly been talking about farmers, but there's obviously cities at the end of these trade corridors. So farmers can bring their wagon to a central location, to a grain elevator that might be connected to the canal, the Gaylord building, or to a center of bringing in grain that's connected to railroads. This huge grain elevator is in New York City. It says Hudson and New York on the building. This is full of corn or wheat that have been grown out in the Great Lakes in the Midwest, but has now arrived in New York through first the Erie Canal and the canal system. Generations later, with all the railroads here, they've come in on railroads, right? So this is a story of cities booming, but many of the cities are booming because they're the places that the agricultural goods are processed and come together. I love this image of a map with Chicago in the far right, imposed onto a corn cob, because all the farmers all across that region are sending their corn to Chicago. The different parts of the corn cob on the top, they're going up to Minneapolis, St. Paul, the bottom right to St. Louis. The far left, the far west, they're going out to Wyoming and Montana. But all, cattle from Montana, corn from Nebraska, it's all going to Chicago. So this corn is important in all these stories, but this is a different world where corn is this huge commodity. And I've shown you this map already. Corn dominates modern agriculture in Illinois. This is a commercial, industrial style of agriculture. Lots of chemical inputs, petroleum inputs, and we are very good at growing corn right now, right? We've added soybeans as well. We're very good at growing soybeans. This is how much of Illinois farmland is devoted to corn and soybeans. The dark brown areas, those counties, 95 to 100% of their croplands are corn or soybeans. The light brown areas, 85 to 94%. So the vast majority of Illinois only grows two crops, corn and soybeans. We've really specialized. And that is very different from our subsistence farmers if you go visit Klein Creek Farm. This is not the same world, even though they're still farming, and they're still farming corn, but it's a very different world. Industrialization, obviously I've been gesturing to factories that make John Deere tractors in Chicago. We're an industrial area here on the edge of the cornfields. Joliet is industrial, Aurora is industrial, Chicago's an enormous industrial juggernaut. This is a map of the major manufacturing centers in 1900. Chicago's one of the biggest in the country. They don't even need to put the southeast or the west on this map. All the manufacturing's around the Great Lakes, right? And you can even see little circles within the Chicago circle that are places like Joliet that are sort of satellites. The nation's population was overwhelmingly rural for the first 100 years of the nation, but in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, the population flips, that by World War I, we're a majority urban nation. People are pouring into Joliet and Rockford and Aurora and Chicago for the factory jobs. So here's immigrants pouring into Chicago, all these different names, Lithuanian, Polish, Irish. What are they doing? They're not farming. They're working in the stockyards. They're slaughtering the cattle from the ranchers out west who are sending their cattle on trains to Chicago. So there's an urban explosion, but the urban explosion is linked to all the farm work that's happening too. So Aurora is going to urbanize and industrialize with railroads. I think you can see the roundhouses here that are the sign of that railroad work in Aurora. Joliet's going to urbanize with quarries and then steel. And Joliet's quite an urban industrial place. This is the Joliet Iron Works, but this is now a historic site. There's no iron being produced there anymore. This region was part of a great industrial heartland. Joliet and Aurora are examples of that. And this was a thriving, job magnet, immigrant magnet, economic boom region from the late 1800s through World War II. But post-World War II, 1960s, 1970s, this isn't the same anymore. There's a process, the last two or three things I want to say is the process of deindustrialization, factories closing down. If you've been through Joliet or similar towns, you know what I'm talking about. That's the Rust Belt world, and we're grappling with what's next. How do we move on from this? In Chicago, a huge international harvester factory closed in 1969. Joblessness. Huge Western Electric plant closes in 1983. They used to make telephones there. None of the telephones in our pockets are made in Chicago anymore, right? This is a bygone world of Chicago as a manufacturing center. Same time as we're losing our factories, our suburbia is exploding. New forces in the landscape, interstate highways and cars and suburbs. You know this, I don't have to explain it to you. The interstate highways are incredibly important. We get this car culture. McDonald's is, has historic roots in our region, the first franchise, and the suburbia. I teach in Naperville, Plainfield. This is great case studies of suburbia, but that used to be farmland. And before that, it was tall grass prairie. And we just keep changing, adding layers onto the land. And people have started saying since 1970, this isn't good. We liked that farmland. This isn't good that we've gotten rid of so much valuable cropland. DuPage County was a farming county past World War II, and then just collapses when the interstate highway comes through, going from 60% farmland to under 10% farmland in less than a normal lifetime. The environmental era is also with us. We're in an era of deindustrialization, an era of suburbanization, and an era of environmentalism, and they're all intertwined, and it's such a complicated mix. But we are more concerned than our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents about industrial pollution, about loss of green space, about loss of farmland, about suburban sprawl. And that's why Medellin is going through the process it's going through, because people care about what's been lost. The 1960s is the beginning of this, authors like Rachel Carson, the first Earth Day in 1970, so you can say, okay, environmentalism starts in 1970, but 50 years out, we're still in the middle of this and figuring out what we're doing with it. There's some local examples. Mae Watts is a Naperville resident who worked at Morton Arboretum, who creates the Illinois Prairie Path. That word prairie, she valued prairie. She hated the way DuPage County was turned into a county of shopping malls and highways and suburbs when she knew it had been a county of farmland and prairie. So she creates a local grassroots activism to create the Illinois Prairie Path. And, generations later, there's a new group of people doing something way bigger with federal government support at Medellin, that they are saying prairie matters, that there's other ways to think about this place, that bison are part of that world. Bison were here in the time of the Illinois and the French. They're back. They're in Nachusa grasslands, they're in Medellin, and tall grass prairie is being valued. So I think we're in a fascinating time where we're figuring out what's next, and to know where we've been helps us think about where we're going. So thank you for your attention today. Yeah.